The first time I saw Evan Rourke's name, I thought it was a clerical mistake. I was sitting at my father's dining table 3 days after his funeral, surrounded by the paperwork death leaves behind when grief is too tired to be dramatic. Insurance statements, pharmacy receipts, property taxes, 12 years of medical records from the memory care facility where Walter Holloway had spent the end of his life forgetting most things in an order that never seemed fair. I was going through everything because I was the executor, because there was no one else, and because practical work had always been easier than sitting still in a quiet house and admitting my father was gone. The visitor logs were clipped to a folder I almost put aside. I only opened them because I was checking dates. December 25th, 11 years earlier, Evan Rourke. December 25th, the next year, Evan Rourke. Again. Same handwriting at first, then different staff transcription, then a digital printout with his name typed cleanly in a box. 11 Christmases, 11 visits. I went back to the beginning and counted twice, as if the number might change. I had never heard the name. That was the part that bothered me more than it should have. My father and I had not been close for a long time, but we had not been strangers either. We had practiced a version of family that required very little from either of us. Birthday calls that lasted 7 minutes. Christmas cards with his handwriting getting shakier every year. Questions about work, whether my apartment building in Seattle had finally fixed the elevator. He knew the title of the documentary series I edited last spring. I knew which knee he had replaced. We were experts in facts that could not hurt us. There had been a time before that, before I was 20, before I sat across from him at this same table and told him I was gay. He had stared down at his hands for so long I remember noticing a nick in one thumbnail. Then he said, "I just don't want this to become the thing people know you for." He did not yell. He did not threaten me. He did not ask me to leave. For years, I almost wished he had. Anger would have given me something solid to push against. Instead, he gave me caution dressed up as concern, and then we both became very polite. By the time he entered memory care, I was living 3,000 miles away and had gotten good at telling myself distance was logistical instead of emotional. I visited when I could. That phrase sounds better than the truth. Some years I came once. Some years I didn't. Christmas was especially easy to avoid because airports were expensive and work deadlines were convenient, and my father never asked me to come. Apparently, Evan Rourke did not need to be asked. I found the address for Harbor Works in one of the estate folders. The name appeared beside equipment my father had donated years earlier, and a newer note from the estate attorney about tools, storage cabinets, and remaining property interests requiring joint inventory. I had planned to deal with that the following week. Instead, 20 minutes later, I was driving toward the waterfront. The town had the exhausted look coastal Maine gets in late November, after the tourists are gone, and before winter becomes picturesque. Salt filmed the edges of the road. Bare trees leaned away from the water. Most storefronts downtown were dark by 4, and the sky had already turned the flat gray blue that made every lit window look warmer than it probably was. Harbor Works occupied an old brick building, 2 streets up from the docks. The painted sign over the entrance had been repaired so many times that 3 shades of navy showed through. Inside, the air smelled like sawdust, metal, and heat from an overworked furnace. No one was at the front desk. I followed the sound of something scraping across concrete. A man stood near the back of the workshop, with both hands raised above his head, steadying a large metal star against a work table. It was nearly 5 feet across, built from welded steel strips with sockets running along the points. Half the bulbs were missing. A cord hung from one side. He looked over when my shoes crossed from tile to concrete. He was around my age, maybe a few years older. Broad through the shoulders, without looking like someone who spent his life in a gym. Dark hair cut short, a little gray near one temple, sleeves pushed to his forearms. There was a small burn mark on the back of one hand, and a pencil tucked behind his ear. What caught me was not that he was attractive. It was the way his face changed when he saw me. Recognition came first, then caution. He lowered the star onto the table. "Dean." I stopped. Most people in town had needed a second look before recognizing me. I had not lived there since college. At the funeral, one of my father's former neighbors had called me David for 10 minutes. This man knew me immediately. Evan Rourke? His expression told me that he understood exactly why I was there. That's me. I held up the copied visitor log I had folded into my coat pocket. For a moment, neither of us said anything. He pulled the pencil from behind his ear and set it on the table. You found those 11 Christmases. Yes. You visited my father every Christmas for 11 years. Yes. I waited for more. He did not offer it. That's usually the point where somebody explains. One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. You've been here 30 seconds. And you've had 11 years. That erased whatever almost smile had been there. I regretted the line as soon as I said it, but not enough to take it back. Evan looked toward the metal star, then back at me. I knew your father a long time. How? He taught me. That surprised me. My father had spent most of his career teaching welding and fabrication at the county vocational school. When? A long time ago. You keep saying that like it answers something. It answers exactly what you asked. I let out a short breath. Did he ask you to visit him? The first time? No. And the other 10? Evan's jaw shifted slightly. There it was. The first real hesitation. Before he could answer, a side door opened, and an older woman carrying safety goggles called his name. Evan answered a question about the next day's youth program and pointed her toward a cabinet. The exchange lasted maybe 15 seconds, but I noticed how different he sounded with her. Easy. Familiar. When he faced me again, the guarded version returned. I'm sorry about Walter, he said. I hated that the sentence sounded sincere. Thank you. He was proud of you. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Evan's eyes narrowed. What? You might want to pick another line. It wasn't a line. My father and I had a complicated relationship. I know. That landed harder than anything else he had said. I stared at him. You know. Evan seemed to realize too late that he had stepped somewhere dangerous. How much exactly did my father tell you about me? He rubbed his thumb once across the burn mark on his hand. Dean. No. You knew my name when I walked in. You know where I live? Seattle. My work? You edit documentaries. The workshop suddenly felt too warm. I folded the visitor log smaller between my fingers. I had never heard of you. Something passed over his face then. Not offense. Something quieter. I know. It should have made me angrier. Instead, it made me curious, in a way I did not want to be. I looked around the workshop. Old drill presses, welding booths, shelves of donated lumber. A row of lockers with handwritten names taped to them. On one wall hung an old photograph of my father, beside a group of teenagers in work aprons. A younger Evan stood at the edge. My father had one hand on his shoulder. Evan followed my gaze. He helped start this place, he said. Not the building. The program. I know he donated equipment. He did more than that. There was no challenge in the words this time. That somehow made them worse. I turned back to him. The estate attorney says there's an inventory I need to complete here. Yes. I was planning to do it next week. Evan nodded toward a small office behind the workshop. Walter kept terrible records. It'll take more than one afternoon. I'm only in town for 2 weeks. Then we should probably start tomorrow. There was something irritatingly calm about the way he said it. I put the visitor log back into my pocket. Fine. Tomorrow. I made it halfway to the door before he spoke again. Dean. I looked back. Evan was standing beside the unfinished star, one hand resting on the steel frame. For the first time since I arrived, he looked less guarded than tired. Your father talked about you more than you think. The next morning, I arrived at Harbor Works 8 minutes late because my father's car refused to start on the first try and then punished me for swearing at it by starting perfectly on the second. Evan was already inside with 2 clipboards, 3 banker's boxes, and a thermos the size of a fire extinguisher. You're late, he said. It's 8 minutes. I noticed. You seem fun before 9. I'm worse after lunch. That was the first time I heard him make a joke without looking like he regretted it. He handed me a clipboard and pointed toward the back storage room. The inventory turned out to be exactly as bad as he had promised. My father had labeled some boxes with dates, others with vague descriptions like good steel and do not throw out, and one entire cabinet contained parts no one under 60 seemed able to identify. Evan knew most of them by sight. He moved through the room with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years being the person everybody called when something broke. I read serial numbers. He confirmed whether equipment still belonged to the estate, had been donated, or had somehow existed in a legal gray area since 2009. We worked for nearly 2 hours before either of us mentioned my father. I was the one who gave in. You said he helped start this program. Evan crouched beside a welding machine, checking a plate on the back. He did. How much? Depends what you mean by help. I usually mean help. He looked up at me. I had the annoying feeling he was getting used to me. Walter convinced the county to let us use an old shop classroom after hours, he said. Then he found donated equipment. Then he bullied 3 businesses into sponsoring safety gear. That sounds like him. You say that like it's an accusation. It's not. It was. A little. Evan stood and brushed dust from his knees. He was good at making institutions uncomfortable until they did something useful. That made me laugh before I could stop myself. My father had once spent 6 months arguing with our town council over a crosswalk near the middle school. Not because either of his children attended anymore, just because he had decided the intersection was badly designed and apparently could not rest until everyone else suffered with him. Evan smiled at my reaction. It changed his face more than I expected. I looked back at my clipboard. The room was suddenly very interesting. Around noon, harbor works filled with people. A retired electrician came in to supervise a repair class. 2 teenagers argued over a bicycle frame. A woman with paint on both sleeves carried a box of cabinet hinges through the shop while talking to Evan about grant forms. He seemed to know everyone without performing friendliness for them. People asked him questions constantly. He answered most. When he did not know, he said so. I found myself watching him more than I needed to. Not because I was attracted to him. That would have been simpler. I was trying to understand how he fit into my father's life. There were traces of Walter everywhere once I started looking. His old handwriting on a laminated safety checklist, a photo from a fundraising dinner, a dented red toolbox with WH scratched into the handle. Every object felt like evidence from a life that had continued here without me. At one point, a teenage boy called from across the room, "Evan, is this gay enough?" I looked up before I could help it. He was holding a metal garden flamingo painted in several alarming colors. Evan studied it seriously. "Needs more glitter." The kid nodded, as if receiving expert consultation. I stared at Evan. He noticed. "What?" "Nothing. You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" Looking at me like I'm part of the inventory. "I'm an editor. Observation is occupational damage." He picked up a marker and wrote something on his clipboard. "You could have just asked." "Asked what?" "If I'm gay." I nearly dropped the stack of equipment tags in my hand. I wasn't going to ask that. Sure. That would be wildly inappropriate. So is staring. I wasn't staring. Evan gave me a look. I hated that I laughed. Fine. I was curious. "I'm gay. Congratulations. Thank you. It's been going well." I shook my head and returned to the tags, aware that my face was warmer than the workshop justified. For the rest of the afternoon, the knowledge sat between us, without actually changing anything. Evan did not flirt. Neither did I. If anything, he became more focused on the inventory. That should have made me relax. Instead, it made me notice stupid things. The way he pushed his sleeves up when they slipped, the small scar near his left thumb, the fact that he read labels aloud under his breath when concentrating. I had known men like him before, competent men, whose confidence came from knowing exactly where the breaker box was, not from needing everyone in the room to notice them. By 4, we had finished one storage room and half of another. I checked the time. Your terrible records estimate was optimistic. I was trying not to scare you off. You've known me 24 hours. I knew your father. That's not the same thing. No. His answer came quickly. I looked at him. He had already gone back to closing one of the boxes. There were moments when Evan seemed to know exactly where the line around my father was, and moments when he stepped over it without realizing. I had not decided which bothered me more. On our way back through the Maine workshop, I stopped beside the metal star from the day before. Someone had moved it onto 2 sawhorses. Up close, I could see that the steel frame had been painted dark blue years ago. Most of the paint was scratched. Several old sockets were rusted through. "My father made this?" Evan came up beside me. "Mostly." "Mostly?" I held things while he complained about my welding. "How old were you?" 20. I turned toward him. That put Evan in my father's classroom at almost exactly the age I had been when I came out. "You've kept it all this time?" "It hung outside the old vocational building first. Then when Harbor Works moved here, Walter wanted it over the front doors every December. He liked Christmas decorations? Not particularly. That sounds more accurate. Evan smiled. He liked making things people expected him not to care about. There was more affection in the sentence than I was prepared for. I touched one of the metal points with my fingertips. Cold. He never made anything like this at home. He didn't? No. Closest thing we had was an artificial tree he bought after my mother died because he said cleaning pine needles was irrational. Evan laughed. I looked at him. You knew about that too? The tree? My mother. His expression softened. Yeah, she had died when I was 17. Cancer. Fast enough that for years afterward I remembered those months as hospital rooms more than seasons. My father and I survived it badly in opposite directions. He became practical. I became desperate to talk. Then eventually I stopped trying. Evan looked back at the star. I need to replace most of the wiring before the open house. When? December 23rd. That's ambitious. I've had worse ideas. You doing it alone? Probably. I heard myself say. I can help. He glanced at me. I immediately wanted the sentence back. Not because I did not mean it, because I did. I know absolutely nothing about this, I added. You know how electricity works? I plug things in. Strong foundation. I edit sound for a living. So you stare at waveforms in a dark room. That is offensively close to accurate. His smile appeared again. Tomorrow night? I hesitated. I was supposed to meet the estate attorney the next morning and spend the evening going through my father's house. I had a list in my phone titled Maine, and nowhere on it did I remember typing, "Repair dead father's Christmas star with attractive stranger." Tomorrow, I said. Evan nodded as though this were a completely ordinary arrangement. I picked up my coat from the chair near the entrance. Before leaving, I turned back. He had already started examining one of the broken sockets. I should have gone. Instead, I said, "Why Christmas?" His hand stopped. Not dramatically, just enough. The workshop had mostly emptied by then, and for the first time all day I could hear the furnace clicking somewhere behind the wall. Evan did not look at me. What? 11 years. Every December 25th, I slid my hands into my coat pockets. You said my father never asked you to come the first time. That's right. So why that day? Evan set the screwdriver down beside the star. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at me. Whatever humor had been there all afternoon disappeared. The first Christmas, your father thought nobody was coming. I stayed by the door. For a second, I did not understand what he meant. Then I did, and irritation rose so quickly it almost felt like embarrassment. He had my number. Evan's face changed. Not defensively. I know. He had my number. He knew where I lived. He knew I existed. I know. So if he thought nobody was coming, that wasn't some tragedy that happened to him. No, that stopped me. I had expected an excuse. Something about pride, or dementia, or how complicated fathers could be. People loved explaining dead men to the people they hurt. Evan did not. He just stood there beside the broken star and let the silence stay uncomfortable. I took my hands out of my coat pockets. What happened? The first year? Yes. Evan looked down at the screwdriver near his hand. I was dropping off a set of shelves I'd made for the activity room. One of the nurses told me Walter had been asking what time it was, every 15 minutes since breakfast. That sounds like him. She thought he was waiting for someone. I looked away. Outside the workshop windows, the street lights had come on. Evan continued carefully. I went to his room to say hello before I left. He had a shirt on I'd never seen him wear before, buttoned all the way up, shoes polished. My father owned exactly one shirt that matched that description, dark green. My mother bought it for him years before she died because she said plaid flannel did not count as formal wear. I hated that I remembered it. He asked me what time it was, Evan said. Then he said the roads might be bad. My jaw tightened. They weren't. No, he knew I wasn't coming. I don't know what he knew. I do. Evan looked at me. I could hear the edge in my own voice and did not bother softening it. I had called him 2 days earlier. I told him I had a deadline and couldn't fly out. Evan nodded once. He didn't tell me that. Of course he didn't. I expected him to defend my father then. Instead, he said, I stayed. I looked back at him. For how long? Until they kicked visitors out. You spent Christmas Day with a former teacher because his son didn't show up. That's not how I thought about it. How did you think about it? Evan shrugged slightly. He looked lonely. The simplicity of the answer made something in me twist. Not guilt exactly. Guilt would have been easier because guilt implies a clear debt and a way to pay it. This was messier. You went back the next year. He asked me to. And then every year after that? Eventually, he stopped asking. So you just kept going? Yes. I looked at the floor between us. There was a fine dusting of metal filings near the workbench. Evan had swept most of them into a neat pile and missed a few. 11 Christmases. 11 years of a ritual I had never known existed. Did you have nowhere else to be? The question came out sharper than I intended. Evan's mouth moved faintly. I had places to be. Family? Some years. Boyfriend? Some years. I looked up. He gave me a small, dry smile. I told you. Gay. Going well. Despite myself, I laughed once. The tension cracked just enough to breathe through. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding since the day before. Did he talk about me? Evan did not answer. That was the answer. I stepped fully back into the workshop. What did he say? Dean, what did he say? Evan's gaze dropped briefly toward the star. He talked about your work. I know that part. He knew when your documentaries aired. That doesn't mean anything. He saved reviews. I stared at him. What? He printed them. My father could barely use email. He made the librarian at the facility help. For some reason, that hurt more than if Evan had told me my father never mentioned me. I pictured him asking some 25-year-old activities coordinator to print an article about a documentary he probably did not understand. I swallowed. What else? Evan was quiet for too long. I felt anger returning, but this time, it had nowhere clean to land. Evan. He asked questions. What kind of questions? Evan rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. About being gay. I thought I had misheard him. My father. Yes. Asked you. Yes. About being gay. Evan nodded. I actually laughed. It sounded ugly in the empty workshop. That is unbelievable. He didn't ask well. I'm shocked. Evan let that pass. He started small. Asked if my parents knew. And? I told him yes. What did he say? That he thought parents probably knew before they were told. I closed my eyes briefly. That sounds exactly like him. He asked what they said when I came out. I opened my eyes. What did you tell him? The truth. Which was that my mother cried because she thought my life would be harder. My father didn't speak to me for almost a year. I looked at Evan. He said it plainly. No tragedy in his tone. No performance. What happened after that? My dad figured himself out eventually. Did you forgive him? Yes. The answer came immediately. That easy? No. Something in Evan's voice made me regret asking. He picked up the screwdriver and turned it between his fingers without using it. Forgiveness isn't the same as pretending someone got it right. I said nothing. He asked me that too. Evan added. What? If forgiveness meant the original thing stopped mattering. I stared at him. My father had asked Evan Rourke whether forgiveness erased damage. He had never asked me anything close. What else? Dean. What else did he ask? Evan exhaled. How do you apologize after waiting too long? The workshop seemed to contract around me. I looked at the star, because looking at Evan suddenly felt impossible. One of the empty bulb sockets was bent inward. I focused on that. He knew my number, I said. Evan did not speak. He had it written on a card next to the phone for years. I know. He could have called me. Yes. He could have said one sentence. Yes. I turned on him. So don't stand there telling me he spent years asking the right questions like that fixes anything. I'm not. You're making him sound like he was trying. He was trying. Not with me. That landed. Evan's face went still. I could hear my breathing. He was practicing on you, I said. That's not the same thing as talking to his son. No. He got to feel guilty. He got to ask thoughtful questions. He got to work through whatever version of regret made him feel better. And I got weather reports. Evan set the screwdriver down. You're right. I stopped. There it was again. No defense. No explanation. No request that I be fair to a dead man. You keep doing that, I said. Doing what? Agreeing with me when I'm trying to argue. I can start lying if it helps. I looked at him. His expression was serious for half a second. Then I laughed. I hated him a little for being able to make me do that. Evan leaned against the table. Walter regretted what happened between you. I felt myself harden again. But regret isn't repair, he added. I said nothing. He knew that too. That makes it worse. Maybe. No. It does. Evan nodded. Okay. We stood there in the ugly yellow workshop light, two men in their 40s arguing over a dead man who had somehow managed to disappoint both of us in entirely different ways. I finally pulled out one of the stools beside the workbench and sat. Evan did not move closer. That mattered. After a while I asked, "Why did he matter so much to you?" Evan looked toward the old photograph on the wall. When I was 17, I stopped showing up to school. Why? My mother was drinking. My father had left. I was working nights at a tire place and pretending I had a plan. He smiled without humor. I did not have a plan. What did my father do? Called me. That sounds invasive. It was. I almost smiled. He told me I could come back the next morning. Didn't ask for an explanation. Didn't make a speech. Evan looked at his hands. I didn't go. What happened? He called again the next day. I knew where this was going. And the next? Yeah. How long? 8 days. I shook my head. That also sounds exactly like him. On the 9th day, I showed up because I wanted him to stop calling. And he did? Never mentioned it. That was my father too. Persistent enough to drag you back. Too proud to talk about what happened once you arrived. I looked at Evan differently after that. Not softer exactly, but the pieces fit better. The Christmas visits were not charity. They were repayment. Then maybe something else. Tomorrow night, Evan said, nodding at the star. You still helping? I looked at the bent sockets, the loose wiring, the scratched blue paint. You trust me with electricity after 2 days? No. Good. But I trust you to hold things. High praise. That's how Walter started me. I glanced at him. For the first time, the comparison did not feel like an intrusion. It felt almost like an invitation. Fine, I said. I'll hold things. Evan smiled, and on the drive back to my father's house, I realized something that annoyed me more than anything Evan had said all evening. I no longer wanted the inventory finished quickly, because finishing meant I could leave. The first evening we worked on the star, Evan made me wear safety glasses, even though I spent most of the time handing him wire cutters. You know I'm 41. Congratulations. I've survived this long without eye protection. That is not the argument you think it is. He was standing on the other side of the workbench, removing one of the rusted sockets while I held the frame steady. Harbor Works had emptied an hour earlier. The overhead fluorescent lights were off except above us, leaving most of the shop in shadow. I had started recognizing the building by sound. The furnace clicked twice before starting. The old compressor in the fabrication room released pressure every 20 minutes. Somewhere behind the office wall, a pipe knocked whenever the heat came on. At work, I spent days removing unwanted noise from recordings. Here, I had begun listening for it. Evan replaced 3 sockets before he asked, "How long were you with the guy in Seattle?" I looked up. "What guy?" "The one you mentioned yesterday." "I mentioned several people yesterday." "The one you dated." I smiled slowly. "Were you listening?" I was standing 6 feet away. That doesn't answer the question. He tightened a screw. "How long?" "Almost 3 years." "That's serious." "Depends who you ask." "I'm asking you." I looked down at the spool of wire in my hand. 2 years and 11 months. Evan glanced at me. "That's specific, huh?" "He moved out before our anniversary." "Sorry. It was mutual." That sounded rehearsed. I laughed. "You're very irritating when you're holding tools. I've been told." The truth was more complicated than mutual. Noah had wanted to move in together after the first year. I said my apartment was too small, so we found a larger place. Then I said, moving during my busiest production cycle made no sense. 6 months later, Noah suggested we take a trip to Vancouver with his sister and her husband. I said I had deadlines. Then his parents invited me for Thanksgiving. I had deadlines again. Eventually, even I could hear the pattern. Noah heard it sooner. "What happened?" Evan asked. I realized I had been quiet. He got tired. "Of you? Of waiting for me to decide if we were building something." Evan stopped working. That annoyed me. Don't what?" "Look at me like you're about to diagnose me." I wasn't. You absolutely were. I was going to ask a question. "That's worse." He set the screwdriver down. "Why didn't you move in with him?" I stared at the star. There wasn't one reason. There usually isn't. I liked my place. Okay. I liked having my own space. Also okay. I was working a lot. Still okay. I looked at him. He waited. I hated how patient he could be. And I rubbed my thumb against the edge of the wire spool. And if you don't combine your life with someone else's, there's less to untangle when it ends. Evan's expression did not change. That sounds efficient. It is. Does it work? It keeps things clean. That wasn't what I asked. I looked away. The exposed bulbs along the star reflected faintly in the lenses of my safety glasses. I took them off. Evan pointed at them. Those stay on. Emotional conversation exemption. Not a thing. I put them back on. He smiled. That should have ended it. Instead, I asked, "Why have you never been married?" His smile disappeared. "Who says I haven't?" I looked at his left hand. No ring. Could be divorced. Are you? No. Widowed? No. Secret second family in Vermont? New Hampshire. I laughed. Then he grew quiet. I came close once. I waited. Unlike Evan, I had enough manners not to interrogate immediately. Apparently, he noticed. "You're not going to ask?" "I'm trying something called boundaries. How's it going?" "Terrible." He leaned back against the workbench. "His name was Michael. We were together 4 years. What happened? He wanted to move to Boston. I wanted to stay here. That's it? That was the argument. What was the actual reason?" Evan looked at me with a faint expression of surprise. "You edit interviews for a living. Unfortunately." He looked toward the dark windows. "Michael used to say, I needed people to need me. That doesn't sound terrible." "It is, if you don't know how to be there when nobody needs fixing." I said nothing. "He wanted a life with me," Evan continued. "Not the workshop, not whatever crisis I was solving. Me. And I kept thinking, if I worked hard enough, took care of enough things, eventually, I'd feel like I deserved that." His voice stayed even. That made it hit harder. "What happened to Michael?" He stopped waiting. The words sat between us. Two men whose relationships had ended because somebody else got tired of waiting. I almost laughed at how embarrassingly obvious the parallel was. Instead, I said, "We're very healthy. Extremely. Any minute now, someone should give us a podcast. I'd rather die." "That can be arranged." We went back to the star. But something had changed. Not because Evan had told me about Michael, because I knew what it cost him to say it. Over the next few days, I spent more time at Harbor Works than I needed to. There was always a reason. The estate inventory. A question from the attorney. A box my father had mislabeled. A socket on the star that Evan claimed required a second pair of hands. None of the reasons were false. They just were not the whole truth. I began learning Evan's rhythms. He forgot lunch when the youth program was busy. He could remember which volunteer had a dentist appointment, but regularly misplaced his own phone. He hated cinnamon gum. He carried a pocket knife that had belonged to his grandfather and used it for everything except what pocket knives were probably intended for. He also knew when to leave me alone. That may have been the first thing I trusted him with. Some evenings, we talked about my father. Some evenings, we did not. On the nights we did not, Walter somehow felt less present rather than more. I started seeing Evan as a person instead of evidence. That was inconvenient. One afternoon, my phone rang while we were sorting donated tools. Noah's name appeared on the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Evan noticed. "You can answer." "I know." I answered anyway. Noah was calling about a documentary company in Portland looking for a senior sound editor. He knew one of the producers. The project would run 6 months and pay better than anything I had lined up for spring. Then he asked when I was coming back to Seattle. "Probably after Christmas," I said. Across the room, Evan stopped labeling a storage bin. Only for a second. Then he continued. Noah said, "I thought you were only staying 2 weeks." So did I. That sentence came out before I had examined it. After the call, Evan kept working. "You have a job offer? Maybe. Portland? Oregon. I know which Portland you meant. People here get territorial." He smiled faintly but did not look up. "It sounds good. It might be. You should take it." I stared at him. There was nothing wrong with the sentence. That was the problem. "You think so? If you want it? And if I don't know?" He finally looked at me. "Then don't decide yet." I waited for something else. Nothing came. For the rest of the afternoon, Evan was perfectly polite. He was also suddenly very busy. Every question I asked received a complete answer. Every joke got a small smile. At 8:30, he said he needed to finish payroll. At 8:35, I was standing outside in the cold, irrationally angry. The next day he did it again. Not distance exactly, just absence where there had recently been attention. It took me embarrassingly long to understand why that bothered me. Then it took me even longer to understand why the possibility that he might be jealous made me feel good. That was worse. On Friday night, we finished replacing the last damaged socket. Evan plugged the star into a test outlet. Nothing happened. Excellent, I said. Very encouraging. He unplugged it and leaned closer to inspect the wiring. I moved beside him. Our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved away. It was the first physical contact between us that lasted long enough to become a decision. Evan turned his head. We were closer than I expected. I could see the faint gray in his beard that I had not noticed from across the workbench. His eyes dropped briefly to my mouth. There it was. No ambiguity left. I should have said something real. Instead, I smiled. So this is where you tell me I wired it wrong. Evan's expression changed. Barely, but enough. He stepped back. I was going to say the connection is loose. Right. He reached for the wire cutters. I stared at the star and wanted to go back 30 seconds. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then I said, Evan. He looked up. I had no idea what I was going to say. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it. Then Evan's gaze moved toward the sound, and whatever opening had existed closed. I pulled the phone out. A message from the estate attorney. Found additional Holloway materials at Harbor Works. Check storage cabinet B17. I read it twice. What is it? Evan asked. Apparently there's more of my father's stuff here. He went still. That was all. But after nearly 3 weeks of watching him, I knew what stillness meant. What's in cabinet B17? Evan did not answer quickly enough. I walked toward the storage room. Behind me, he said my name. I opened the cabinet. Inside was a gray metal box with my father's handwriting across the lid. Dean. I stood in front of the open cabinet with one hand still on the metal door. Behind me, Evan did not move. The box was not large. Gray steel, dented at one corner. The kind of thing my father used to store drill bits or receipts he did not trust filing cabinets with. My name had been written across the lid in thick black marker. Not Dean Holloway. Not personal. Just Dean. In the block capitals I had watched appear on lunch bags, birthday cards, and labels in our garage when I was a kid. How long has this been here? Evan answered quietly. A while. I turned around. That's not a unit of time. His face had gone pale under the workshop lights. Dean. How long? Several years. I looked back at the box. The latch opened with a stiff metallic snap. Inside were 3 small digital recorders, an envelope, and a stack of memory cards in plastic sleeves. Each sleeve had a date written on it. Some had only a year. Others had a month and day. My hands went cold. What is this? Evan came closer, but stopped several feet away. Walter started recording things after his handwriting got worse. For who? He looked at the box. I already knew. I picked up the first recorder. The battery was dead. Evan said, "There's a charger in the office." Of course there was. 10 minutes later, we were sitting at opposite ends of the small office, while the recorder rested between us on the desk. I pressed play. Static came first. Then my father cleared his throat. Dean. I stopped the recording. My hand was shaking. Evan looked at the floor. I pressed play again. Dean, there's something I should have said a long time ago. A pause. Long enough that I checked whether the recorder had frozen. Then my father breathed out. No, that's not right. The file ended. I stared at the device. That's it? That one. Yes. I picked another memory card. The next recording lasted 48 seconds. Dean, I spent a long time believing giving you space was the same thing as accepting you. I think maybe I told myself that, because it meant I didn't have to be uncomfortable. Silence. Then, my father swore under his breath. The file stopped. The third recording was worse. Not because he said anything cruel. Because he tried to say my name 4 times before forgetting why he had turned the recorder on. I took off my glasses and pressed my palms against my eyes. For 11 years, I had imagined my father sitting in that care facility, thinking about nothing more complicated than television schedules and whether the soup had enough salt. Instead, he had apparently spent at least part of those years rehearsing apologies he never gave me. I looked at Evan. You knew. He did not pretend otherwise. Yes. How much? I knew he was recording. How long? Evan's jaw tightened. Dean. How long? About 6 years. I stood so quickly the chair hit the wall behind me. You knew for 6 years. He never gave me permission to send them. You had my address. Yes. You had my phone number. Yes. You knew where I worked. Yes. Each answer made me angrier. You could have called. I know. I laughed once, because apparently that was what my body did when anger got too large for anything else. You know, Evan stood. Walter told me the recordings weren't finished. He's dead. I know that too. And you were what? Waiting for him to finish? No. Then what were you waiting for? Evan looked toward the recorder. When his memory started getting worse, he stopped understanding consistently what the files were. Some days he wanted me to erase them. Other days he told me not to touch them. I didn't know which version of that decision was really his. So you made the decision yourself. I left them alone. That is a decision. He went quiet. The anger sharpened. You decided I was better off not knowing. I thought unfinished recordings might hurt you more than help. There it is. Dean. No. Say it again. He looked at me. You thought. Yes. You thought I wasn't ready. I thought there was no way to know what Walter wanted, once he couldn't tell me clearly. This isn't about what he wanted anymore. I pointed at the recorder. That has my name on it. I know. You don't get to decide what hurts me less. Evan flinched. It was small, but I saw it. Good, I thought. Then immediately hated myself for thinking it. He did not raise his voice. I was trying to protect something he couldn't explain anymore. And you protected him. I thought I was protecting both of you. That's the problem. The office felt too small. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair. Evan took one step forward. I stopped him with a look. My father spent 20 years deciding silence was easier for me. That's not what I was doing. It is exactly what you were doing. I wasn't ashamed of you. That doesn't make it different enough. That landed. His face changed. For the first time since I had met him, Evan looked like he had no answer. I picked up the gray box. These belong to me. Yes. He did not argue. That somehow made leaving harder. I drove back to my father's house with the box strapped into the passenger seat like something fragile. I did not listen to any more recordings that night. Instead, I packed. Not dramatically. I folded clothes, closed my laptop, put toiletries in a bag, called the estate attorney, and told her I would finish the remaining paperwork remotely. She sounded surprised, but did not ask questions. At 11:30, my phone buzzed. Evan. I stared at his name before opening the message. I expected an explanation, maybe another defense. Instead, it said, I thought I was helping. I was deciding for you. Those aren't the same thing. I'm sorry. That was all. No request to call him. No please come back. No excuse. I read it 6 times. Then I put the phone face down. The next morning, I left before sunrise. The town was barely awake. Harbor Works was dark when I passed it. For one stupid second, I looked toward the front of the building, as though I might see Evan standing outside. Of course he was not. I drove south. The farther I got from town, the easier everything should have felt. The inventory was almost finished. The house could be sold. The estate attorney knew what to do. Seattle had work waiting. Noah's Portland contact wanted to talk on Monday. There was nothing irresponsible about leaving. That was the argument I kept making. About an hour later, I stopped for gas and found an old interview file on my laptop while looking for a charging cable. It was from a documentary I had edited 2 years earlier about adult siblings reconnecting after decades apart. I remembered the interview because the audio had been terrible. Refrigerator hum, traffic outside, a microphone placed too far from the subject. I played it anyway. An older woman's voice filled the car. She said that when people stopped talking, everyone got to invent a reason for the silence. Sometimes the invented reason was kinder than the truth. Sometimes it was crueler. But after enough years, nobody remembered which parts had ever been real. I stopped the file. For a long time, I sat at the pump, with both hands on the steering wheel. My father had avoided a conversation because he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Evan had hidden the recordings because he was afraid of making the wrong choice, and now I was driving 3,000 miles away because asking one man what I actually meant to him felt more dangerous than losing him without finding out. Different reasons, same silence. I looked at Evan's message again. He had not asked me to stay. That mattered. Maybe more than if he had. For most of my adult life, I had waited for people to prove they wanted me badly enough to overcome every wall I put in front of them. Then, when they eventually stopped trying, I called it evidence. Noah had stopped waiting. My father had stopped trying. And I had built an entire philosophy around never being the person who asked someone to come closer. I started the car. At the next intersection, the highway entrance pointed south, Seattle. The road back to town pointed north. I sat through one green light, then another. A truck behind me finally honked. "Yeah," I muttered. "I know." I turned left, back toward Harbor Works. Not because Evan had asked me to, because no one had. By the time I reached Harbor Works, it was almost noon. The front doors were unlocked. Inside, the Saturday class was gone, and most of the building was quiet, except for the soft metallic tap of something being set down on a workbench. Evan was standing under the star, not repairing it, just looking at it. He turned when he heard me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he said, "You came back." It was not a question. I put my keys on the nearest table, because my hands needed something to do. I did. He waited. That was one of the things I had begun to understand about him. When Evan did not know what he was allowed to fix, he went still. I walked closer. "I'm still angry. I know. You don't get points for knowing. No. And I'm not pretending the recordings make everything okay with my father. I wouldn't ask you to." I looked at him. He looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes, and the same shirt he had been wearing the night before was wrinkled at the sleeves. "I listened to more of them," I said. His jaw tightened slightly. One of them was 7 minutes long. He spent 4 of those minutes talking about a hardware store that closed in 1998. Evan's mouth almost moved. "I remember that one." "Of course you do." The corner of his mouth lifted, then disappeared again. I took a breath. There was another one where he said he thought asking about my life would sound fake after so many years of not asking. Evan did not say anything. He was probably right. Probably, but he still should have asked. "Yes," I nodded. "And you should have told me about the recordings." "Yes. You don't get to protect me by choosing which truth I can handle." "I know." I shook my head. "Stop saying that." Evan looked at me carefully. "Okay, say something else." He glanced down at his hands. Then he said, "I was wrong." The words were simple. No qualification followed. I thought leaving the box alone meant I wasn't interfering, but I was making a choice. I told myself it was respectful, because that sounded better than admitting I was scared I'd give you something you couldn't put back down. He lifted his eyes to mine. "I should have trusted you with your own pain." That was the sentence. Not because it fixed anything, because it named exactly what had been taken from me. I looked away for a moment. When I spoke again, my voice came out quieter. "I left this morning because I didn't want to ask you something." Evan did not move. "What?" I laughed once, without humor. "This is the part I'm very bad at." I noticed. I looked at him. He gave me the smallest possible smile. It helped. I stepped closer to the workbench. "I keep saying people leave me." Evan stayed quiet. "But that's not entirely true." I looked at the scratched blue frame of the star. "I make it easy." He watched me. "I don't ask for much. I don't make plans too far ahead. I don't let people build anything around me that would hurt to dismantle later." My throat tightened, but I kept going. And then, when they stop waiting for me to want more, I tell myself they proved my point. Evan said nothing. I could hear the furnace start behind the wall. I was going to do that with you. His eyes shifted. I was going to get on the highway and call leaving the mature thing. Then I realized I didn't even know what I was leaving. Evan took one slow breath. "What are you asking me, Dean?" There it was, the open door. No rescue, no guess. I had to walk through it myself. "I'm asking if this was just grief to you." "No." The answer came so fast that something inside me loosened. "I'm asking if I imagined what happened between us." "You didn't." "I'm asking if you want me here, even when I'm not helping with the estate." "Yes." I looked at him. He did not look away. The last question was harder. Not because I did not know the words, because I did. Will you stay if I stop making it easy for you to leave? Evan's face changed. The answer took 1 second, maybe less. Yes. My chest hurt. He stepped closer, but stopped before touching me. But you have to stay too. I nodded. I know. Dean, I know. This time, I was the one who closed the distance. The kiss was not dramatic. No one dropped anything. The star did not suddenly light behind us. His hand came up carefully to the side of my face, and he paused long enough for me to decide whether I wanted it there. I did, so I leaned into him. The kiss was warm and brief, and strangely ordinary for something I had spent weeks avoiding. When we pulled apart, Evan looked at me and said, "You're still wearing your coat." I laughed. "That's your first line after kissing me? You look overheated." I drove an hour back here for emotional growth and poor temperature management. I took off the coat. It felt, somehow, like staying. Nothing changed quickly after that. I went back to Seattle in January because I had work and a lease and a life there. Evan did not ask me to abandon any of it. I did not ask him to prove anything by leaving Harbor Works. For the first few months, we flew back and forth badly. Missed connections, expensive tickets. One disastrous weekend when a storm kept me in Boston overnight, and Evan fell asleep on the phone while I complained about airport carpeting. We argued too. The first time Evan made a decision for me without asking, I told him before resentment had 3 weeks to ferment. The first time I disappeared into work for 2 days and answered every personal question with, "I'm fine." He told me he was not going to translate silence forever. Neither conversation was romantic. Both mattered more than the kiss. By spring, I started taking more remote editing contracts. Not because Evan needed me in Maine, because I discovered I wanted a life there that belonged to me too. Harbor Works had an unused room with terrible acoustics and a door that never shut correctly. I helped turn it into a small recording studio. We started an oral history project with local fishermen, retired teachers, teenagers, anyone willing to sit behind a microphone and tell the truth badly. Evan said the room looked expensive. I told him it looked intentional. He said that was what expensive people called expensive. We were still arguing about it in December. The following Christmas morning, we drove to the memory care facility together. Walter had been gone a year. Evan had not stopped visiting. He knew residents whose families lived far away, others whose families lived 15 minutes away and rarely came. He brought repaired radios, old magazines, and a box of wooden puzzle pieces someone at Harbor Works had made. I carried 2 trays of cookies I had not baked. An elderly man named Frank beat me 3 times at checkers and accused me of cheating each time he lost track of whose pieces were whose. Around noon, I walked past the old visitor desk. For a moment, I saw the logs exactly as I had found them. Evan Rourke, December 25th, 11 years. I used to think those signatures belonged to a story about my father. Now I understood they also belonged to Evan. Showing up had become something he chose, even after there was no debt left to repay. That evening, we returned to Harbor Works. The building was empty. Outside, the restored star hung above the entrance. Evan plugged in the timer. One by one, the bulbs came on, until the whole blue steel frame glowed against the dark brick. Almost the whole thing. One bulb near the top flickered twice. I pointed. "You missed one." "I know." I waited for him to get the ladder. He didn't. He stood beside me with his hands in his pockets, watching the imperfect star shine. "You're not fixing it?" "Tomorrow." I looked at him. A year earlier, that would have been impossible. I smiled. For most of my life, I thought love was proven by who stayed without being asked. It took me 41 years to learn that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is ask.